Rights Forum 2021. I'm really excited to be hosting it again. It's the second year that we're doing it. I say we, but I actually just turn up and have great conversations with people. The real work is happening behind the scenes, so thank you to the team. My name's Rita Loy. I am a music artist and writer, and I'm also CEO and founder of an organisation called Gations. Gations is the UK alliance of 26 organisations. Actually, we've just signed our first US partner, and we work with the LGBTQIA+ community around the world who are South Asian. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists and talks. You're in for a brilliant afternoon. We're going to be going through till 6 p.m. today. There are actually 2 panels. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping first. My pronouns are she, they. I've got pink hair and I'm wearing a light blue shirt. And my skin is a gorgeous golden brown colour because I'm Indian. So I've got some really, really exciting panelists to announce in a second, but I've got to do a little bit more housekeeping with you. Now, some of you might have actually seen me yesterday because I was in Manchester for Pride over the weekend. So happy Pride, everyone. It was absolutely fantastic. I was hosting the Alan Turing stage in Sackville Gardens and also performed a track called Remedy, which actually covers a lot of the themes we're going to be talking about today. This event is going to be, it's live broadcast, but it's going to be recorded and available afterwards as well. We've got the wonderful Russ here, who is our BSL interpreter. Russ is a 50+ white man. He's bald, he's got a beard. He's a nice man, he told me to say. But I have to say, I agree. He's wearing he's changed. He's now wearing an olive shirt. Very nice indeed. So there's live captioning happening as well. So there's a link that's going to be dropped into the chat box. And what else can I tell you about admin stuff? I think that's it covered. Okay. In terms of the running order, we're going to be doing about 45 minutes of questions with the panelists. And then we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. So that's at 4 o'clock. We're gonna have some questions from all of you. You can drop your questions into that chat box, as I mentioned. So we've got about 20 minutes for that. Then we're gonna have a 20-minute break till 4:40, and we're going to be joined for the second half of this afternoon, which is a second panel that's going to be chaired by the fabulous Ben Peachy. So I'm your host for this next sort of hour and a half or so. And like I said, the whole thing wraps at 6 p.m. So the overall theme this year is freedom, right? Which is huge, right? Massive theme, which is why I'm really excited to have panelists that are from all over the world, because we're really looking at what it means to be LGBTQIA+ around the world, right? And I think that's sort of in some ways, a bit of an evolution that's happened quite naturally because of the pandemic as well, right? And the way that we're connecting, and because of social media, and we're able to now bring that connectedness into this forum with panelists that are from all over the world. Absolutely game changing. And we're going to talk about what the power of pride is collectively. Okay, I'm going to move over to each of them to introduce themselves. But after we wrap, make sure you stick around for panel 2 as well with Ben, and that's going to be on queerness as resistance, which sounds awesome as well. So moving on to our guests, we have got Debbie, Jason, Kay, and Sen, and I'm going to ask each of them to just introduce themselves. Hi everyone, how are you all doing? Happy Pride.
Hey.
Happy Pride.
Oh yeah, that's better now. I'm in company. This is great. It's always a bit weird just being the only one on screen. You can only see yourself. I wish I could see everybody that was here as well, that was that was watching and listening. Welcome to all of you. You all look fantastic. I'm really excited for today. Thank you so much for joining. If I can get a little intro from each of you about yourselves and a little bit, you know, where you're from in the world and the kind of work that you do specifically for the LGBTQ plus community. If I can start with you, Debbie.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's the morning where I'm at. I'm here in Ottawa, which is also known as the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. In our movements here in Canada, we like to pay homage to the traditional lands in which we're on, especially as Canada being a white settler country. And so I first wanted to acknowledge where I'm calling from. A little bit about me. I am a Black cisgender queer woman who was born and raised in Canada, but I am Ghanaian. So I have a Black tank top on. I'm wearing golden Africa earrings to represent, and I have lovely dark skin because I'm West African. I'm very proud of my heritage. I've been in Ottawa for the last 11 years. I grew up in the Toronto area in a very multicultural, diverse place, which I give credit to giving me the lived experience I have that kind of guides me as an activist. My work within the 2S LGBTQ community started in the student movement when I was in university, where I was kind of, you know, getting my wings as an activist and embracing radical politics, where I, you know, was a young Black feminist doing feminist conscious raising, organizing, doing a little shit disturbing on campus when it came to things like gender-based violence or anti-Black racism. And later on, my work kind of took me to do community activism, where I did work within the women's rights movement, within the fight against police brutality here in the city, and also doing sex education work. And I organized Ottawa Dyke March here in the city for about 3 to 4 years. And for folks who don't know what Ottawa Dyke March is, it is essentially, for us, a trans-inclusive, anti-capitalist, dyke-centered protest that we have every Saturday before the Sunday march to claim space and remain one of the very few radical events here in Capital Pride in Ottawa. And then eventually got into international development, which eventually led me to working as the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. So we're a national youth-focused organization that addresses discrimination against 2S LGBTQ people through advocacy, education, and through awareness. And so that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. Wow. Slaying literally in every possible way. Big time finger snapping here. Thank you, Debbie. Really excited to hear more from you. And next, if I can move on to Jason, for you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. It's absolutely fabulous to be here with you today. I'm very, very honored to join you. My name is Jason Jones, and I'm an LGBTQ plus activist from Trinidad and Tobago. I've been working in LGBTQ activism for 34 years. And I first came to London from Trinidad in 1985. My first gay pride was 1987, a year before Section 28. And Section 28 was really the catalyst for me becoming an activist. After escaping very serious homophobic bullying in the Caribbean, coming to London and seeking my freedom to have my freedom curtailed by Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party in Section 28 was really having the carpet pulled out from under me. So Section 28 really was the seeds of my activism. I then, in 1996, my partner from Trinidad and I became members of the Stonewall Immigration Group, who are now known as Rainbow Railroad. And my partner from Trinidad and I were the first of 40 test cases to challenge the law, to change the law in the United Kingdom to allow the overseas partner of a British subject residency based on a de facto relationship. We were successful, and this is the first positive gay legislation ever in the United Kingdom post-decriminalization in 1967. So I've been a part of changing the law in 2 countries. I'm actually the only activist in the world who has been able to do that. And that's because I'm mixed race and I call myself Tringlish. I am both Trinidadian and English. I'm a citizen of both countries. After this, I then formed the first LGBT, I was one of the founding members of one of the first LGBT organizations in the Caribbean, in the Southern Caribbean, called the Lambda Group. Unfortunately, the group fell apart. Trinidad and Tobago had the dubious distinction of having the second highest mortality rate from HIV/AIDS between 1982 and 1992, and we lost over 3/4 of our board membership to HIV/AIDS. I then returned to London, and my partner and I again won this law through the Rainbow Railroad and lobbying. And I was sat here in London thinking, well, what can I do for my LGBT siblings back home? You know, it's one thing to be safe in the global north, but, you know, I had access to resources and access to great lawyers who would work pro bono for me. So I challenged the government of Trinidad and Tobago in 2017 to remove the British colonial era discriminatory laws of the Sexual Offences Act. There were two laws that criminalized us. One was the Buggery Act, which was created by Henry VIII in 1533 in England. It was the first anti-gay legislation in the world, and it was spread across the entire Commonwealth. Right now, 34 Commonwealth countries, former British colonies, still have these laws criminalizing us. So I challenged these laws in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago, and I was successful. And in 2018, April the 12th, the laws were struck down as being unconstitutional. My next steps are the laws have been appealed by the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, which is the right thing to do. He's not doing this because he's homophobic. The reason is the way the courts work is you have different levels of court. I've won at the first level. There are two different levels, again, that I have to win to have final victory. So I will be heard at the Appeal Court of Trinidad and Tobago sometime over the next year. And then my case will be heard at the Privy Council, which is our Supreme Court, which is here in London. And most excitingly, this is the first time that the Privy Council will ever hear an LGBT decriminalization case. And my victory at the Privy Council will lead to decriminalization of at least 7 and possibly 11 other countries around the world. So we have the possibility with my one case to decriminalize the entire North and South American continent and over 55 million people. So
wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jason. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about how these conversations are gonna weave together as well. I'm gonna move on to Kay now. If you could introduce yourself, please, and the work that you do.
Hi, everyone. Peace. My name is Kay Ulanday Barrett. I am a transgender, non-binary Filipinx person currently living in the United States, otherwise known as specifically in the Lenape-Munsee tribal area, otherwise known as New Jersey and New York. Currently, description. I'm a brown, round boy. I am wearing a lace, white, netted, cute shirt. I have shiny black glasses and a lilac Supreme fitted. And in the background is my dog bed and plants. Anoba. My work has really encapsulated the last 15 years or so. I started out as a houseless trans queer teen, essentially, and that was the invitation and the difficulty to start doing organizing work and education work. My mother was a migrant, undocumented domestic worker. So her work, she organized domestic workers, Filipinx, South Asian, and Caribbean migrant workers. So I was automatically introduced to the politicalization of everything we do. So much of my work had to deal with writing at first. I did a lot of writing. And so from that, I'm currently an author, an essayist, and napper, A+. And I've gotten 2 books. And my most recent book, More Than Organs, got an American Library Association Honor Book Award and a Lambda Literary Foundation Finalist Award. I've worked separately. I don't think that art is independent of the world. I believe in collective care and liberation for all. So a lot of my work also delves into trainings, collectives, organizations, colleges, and universities. I've done all the Ivies, talking to all the rich white cis people trying to steal their money and give it back to where it belongs. And I've worked for Disability Justice Collective, the Audre Lorde Project, the Trans Justice Funding Project, and the Transgender Law Center. So if there's ableism or queer hate or some anti-Blackness happening, I, as a non-Black POC, try to navigate and shift those resources towards where they belong.
Wow, amazing. Again, absolutely incredible. Really, really privileged to have you all here, and really excited. Wish we had more time, actually. And Sen, can I move on to you next? And is it okay to call you Sen?
Absolutely it is. Hi, everyone. My name is Sen Raj. I'm an associate professor of human rights law based at Manchester Law School. But my trajectory is also a complicated one. You may tell from my accent that I'm not from the UK. I grew up in Sydney, Australia, or Gadigal country, which of course is also unceded land as a sovereign peoples who never ceded their space to colonization. So I grew up in Sydney, and I did a lot of my early career work on LGBT rights there. I worked for the gay and lesbian rights lobby. And of course, a little bit about me. Physically, I am a cis, dark brown guy, Sri Lankan Tamil heritage, if you like, where my family's from. I'm currently dressed in a white t-shirt and a lovely hot pink jacket, which I wear all the time. I've got my Progress flag pin on. And in the background, I have an assortment of images and postcards that I've collected from various queer art festivals that I have been to over the years. So in terms of my work, my friends often refer to me as a professional gay because it adequately sums up, I suppose, how my personal, my professional and academic life sort of interweave. So I do a lot of work primarily on the rights of people who seek asylum, and with a particular focus on people who experience persecution on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And I've been fortunate to do that work in Australia and now continue to do that work here in Manchester in the UK. And I've had the pleasure of working with a number of wonderful local organisations here like Rainbow Noir, African Rainbow Family. And it's been a real gift to be in this city and to sort of become an honorary Manc, as some people have referred to me now, which I take as a compliment.
That's amazing. Thank you, Sen. And thank you, all of you. It's like I said, it's such an honor to have you all here. And I wish we had more time to talk. But we have literally an hour. We have about 40 minutes, 45 minutes to run through a few questions. And then we'll go to audience Q&A. So I want to sort of, I feel like our conversation today kind of is really related to a few different themes that there's sort of broadly intertwined together. I think we're talking about decolonization. I think we're talking about allyship, and I think we're talking about freedom and how those things connect, you know, at this point in time. So with that lens, if you could sort of view things with that lens in order to just sort of keep things concise in the time that we have. So the first thing I really wanted to touch on is from each of you to really get an understanding for ourselves and each other and everybody that's participating in terms of your cultural background and how that influences your fight for queer freedom. Because I think we all have nuanced experiences culturally, and we have varying identities that in some way cross over or connect. So I'm interested to see what the answers are to that. I'm happy to go around again in the same order, or unless somebody wants to go first, I'll start with you, Debbie.
Yeah, I love this question. So I mentioned a little in my intro that I am Ghanaian. So family's from Ghana. I wear it with pride. Seriously, it's in my last name. You're not going to find that name out anywhere else. I think very much so when I say that I am a proud Black queer woman. What I am doing is not part of like this idea of like progress, like, oh my God, we've made it, we're progressing forward. No, I'm reclaiming what has been robbed from my people, specifically my ethnic group, the Achim, who are a subgroup of the Akan in Ghana, which is the major ethnic group. I'm reclaiming an identity that has been stripped away through the colonial process of introducing modern concepts of gender and sexuality, which, very fitting, the British introduced to my people. And so part of my identity as a Ghanaian Canadian and like operating within like two spaces in a way is that I can't separate the two. Being queer, multiple identities, being queer, being a woman, being Black, being Ghanaian, they're all part of who I am and part of the journey I'm taking towards liberation and what I'm doing for community. And so I think it's really important for me to center, or at least start off by like saying, I am from an ethnic group that has lost traditional understandings of gender, but has reclaimed it in different ways. And as an out loud queer woman, I'm doing something that is considered taboo and is still a controversial issue, even within the diaspora group here in Canada. And I think in being out loud, I don't intend to be a role model, but if I can be a possibility model to other queer Africans, that is something that I'm doing, because that fight towards liberation is what I cannot do alone. And so if I can be present, it is something that I'm hoping can bring some folks along the way with me.
Amazing. I love that. There's so much in that I completely relate to as well. I think it is really hard. It is really hard to separate different aspects of our identities, or intersections as we're sort of increasingly referring to them, although we could go down a whole rabbit hole in terms of the usage of that word as well. But I think there are different aspects of identity. It's really, really hard to unmesh those things, because they're often sitting in so many nuanced ways that it's really hard to pull them apart. I don't know if I guess, Kay, perhaps you have something interesting to say about that next.
I think, you know, in the United States, and my mom as like a migrant, growing up in a mixed migrant household, right? Mixed statuses, different levels of danger by white supremacy on my family. Like, we like bargains, you know, Philip, the joke is like, we like a bargain. So I feel like in the United States, we're all like, oh, that's a two for free, whatever. I feel like I'm a 5 for. Like right now you are talking to 5 different people, right? I'm disabled, I'm Filipinx, I'm queer trans, I mean, 5.5, Filipinx, all these things, right? And I think when we're talking about intersectionality, right, that concept by Black American feminist Kimberly Crenshaw from the Combahee River Collective, it's that all of us, all the things that happen, breathe all at once. And so for me, depending on the landscape, the region, the place, whether I'm looking for a job, if I'm in the medical complex, if I'm in the legal system, if I'm trying to access housing, depending on that place, it just hits where I may or may not get resources. You know, like I'll go on the subway and I'll go to the disabled section to sit down, and any given context, somebody will be like, oh, you're a, you know, racial slur. Oh, you're a chink. You don't need to sit down. Or, oh, you know, are you a boy or a girl? So it happens all at once. And in the same context, that brilliance happens all at once. Like all the joys I have from my lineages, all of them, my trans justice lineages, my Filipinx organizing background, my migrant community background, my disabled background, all of those things inform the ways in which I love, and in the ways I reimagine my art, and in the ways I really believe in collective care. Like we are an ecosystem together, connected to our ancestors. And so for me, that's where I'm trying to work from. It's a struggle, but all those things have to breathe together, or we're just not going to get liberation if we're being selective, nah? Like if we don't prioritize all of who we are, we're not bringing everything we can to the universe in our work.
Yeah, 100%. I think, you know, we have to, we've learned to compartmentalize, or we've been taught to compartmentalize in order to survive, right? And we can only reveal certain parts of ourselves in certain spaces, or we have to, you know, in its mildest form, it's called code switching now, right? But actually, there's a real mental health impact in terms of actually being different versions of self in different spaces. But that's what we've had to do to survive. And so, you know, many of us are in this process of being our full self, bringing our complete self into all spaces. I'm certainly doing that increasingly. The more I'm doing it, the more I'm finding that there's more and more and more that I've been sort of censoring or holding back or hiding. And it feels like a lifetime's work. And it does also feel very transgenerational as well. It's not just my work that I'm doing. I don't know, Sen, what has been your experience of that? I mean, do you relate to that? I'm assuming that you do.
I do. I mean, I think it's really wonderful or to hear from Kay and Debbie about their experiences, because as we know, we live so much of our truth in our politics, and so much of that involves the multidimensional aspects of our lives: race, gender, ethnicity, whether we have a disability or not, our cultural background, our religion. I think what's really pertinent for me, I grew up in a Tamil family where politics was really foregrounded because, you know, my family lived a context of civil war and displacement up north in Sri Lanka as an ethnic and linguistic minority. And so I was quite political at that at a younger age. And I was also really fortunate being queer in a very affirming family, which, you know, people talk about, you know, you come from a brown Hindu, very religious Hindu family, you must have had a really tough time coming out. But actually, I didn't. And I know that's probably unique to some people, but I want to tell that story because I think it's so important to talk about the gift of family that a lot of us come from, and how we receive that, and how nourishing it is to have those sorts of families, however we define that, behind us. And one thing I've been working towards myself is to cultivate spaces and communities where everyone can flourish in that way, where people can live every aspect of who they are, which is why when I talk about pride, I love pride. But I also find it deeply disheartening when people think about pride in these very narrow, compartmentalized ways. It's that, oh, it's just about being gay, or it's just about being lesbian, as if somehow we don't have multiple identities around whether we're cis or trans, or whether we have a disability or not, whether we're from a racialized minority or not, you know. And I think that this is really unfortunate consequence of how we compartmentalize. And, you know, I've had people who, you know, will revel at pride and then complain about why there's a black pride, saying, well, no, everything should be equal. And I keep thinking, well, that's what straight people say when we talk about having a gay pride. You know, and people see, you know, having ethnic or cultural specificities around pride as being, you know, ghettoizing. And I just say, well, how dare you? I mean, then what is pride if not a type of ghettoizing in some ways? But that's part of what I want to see more of, is this kind of cultural flourishing of our different communities in different spaces. And I think I found it in my own background really wonderful to be in spaces of queer and trans people of color, because it is in those spaces that I can feel really at ease, where I don't have to code switch as much. You know, when I used to work in the gay and lesbian rights lobby, I used to be in predominantly white gay spaces, and it was exhausting. Cis male white gay spaces, to be more precise. And, you know, I'd have people talking about equality and inclusion on one hand, and yet being deeply racist, transphobic, ableist on the other. And it was just so jarring. So, you know, it's a little bit therapeutic to be on this panel today, I've got to say, to be able to hear from everyone and to kind of echo a lot of the conversations that have had what we're having today, but also what we've been having for many, many decades. You know, Kay mentioned the Combahee River Collective. I mean, you know, these are 50-year-old Black feminist, queer women of color engagements that we are building from. And I think it's important to talk about that ancestral history as we continue.
Thanks, Anne. I think that's brilliant. And I think actually, you know, it leads really nicely onto Jason, because I'm really intrigued to know what your feelings are about this, because having witnessed so much change, having witnessed so much legislation change, you know, and we're always sort of pushing for legislation change. And, you know, but I was overjoyed when India changed legislation in 2018. But what are the observations that you have in terms of what has changed in your lifetime? Because in many ways, I feel like some of the things that we're talking about are things that when we're looking at allyship and the sort of unification that's happening at the moment, we're aiming for, we're doing, and with conversations like this, I feel like these happened in the past. We had examples of the gay liberation movement and the civil rights movement working together, or parts of them working together at least, in order to create change and reveal that allyship. But I think, you know, was it a simpler time where it was easier to unite against a common enemy and topple them, or you know, are things? It just feels like things are much more fragmented now, and I don't know how much of that is to do with identity politics or what that is, if that's technology and social media. But what's your take on it? What do you think has changed in your experience in your time?
Well, the simple answer is no. Not a lot has changed. 2 days ago was the 50th anniversary of the first ever LGBT protest in London. And if you go back in history, in 1971, there was a coming together in Philadelphia of the Black Panther Party and the gay rights movement and the feminist movement. And they had a seminar pulling together all of our struggles, and that all collapsed. So this is nothing new. You know, we come together and then we fragment. We come together and then we fragment. I think what we're seeing happening now with the rise of right-wing politics is, you know, us starting to come together again. And I gave a speech at the Bishopsgate Institute to commemorate the 50th anniversary of that seminar in Philadelphia 50 years ago. And I called for a coming together of the LGBT community in the UK. We have never had a coming together of our community. And literally a day later, the Conservative government announced that they are hosting a coming together of the LGBT community. So they're trying to pinkwash it and trying to take control and ownership of what our movement is going forward. What I would like to also talk about in terms of legislative reform, and you mentioned the India victory, which came a couple of months after mine, and my case was cited in that victory. So it just shows that each little step is incremental in creating transformation. But when you talk about colonialism and how that has impacted on our nations that were former colonies of Britain, a lot of white gay people tell me in Britain, well, you know, this is no longer the UK's problem. You've been independent for 54 years. But what people don't know is that when Trinidad and Tobago became independent, like many former colonies of Britain, Britain forced into our constitution something called a savings law clause. And the savings law clause insulates challenges of any laws that predate our independence. So things like the death penalty, things like the buggery law, none of these laws can be challenged in our courts, and we are now independent. This savings law clause was instituted by the British government. It was created so that if the experiment of independence failed, if we as Black people, as people of color, failed in this concept of independence, the British could walk back in and all the laws would have remained the same. So, you know, for me to be able to overturn that law was not just about the rights of LGBT people. It was a huge constitutional reform. Right now, I am recognized in Trinidad and Tobago as a hero of constitutional reform, not just as an LGBT activist, because I took a big axe to this savings law clause. And when this case is heard at the Privy Council will then have a moment in history where it can reverse the savings law clause and remove it so that we are no longer shackled by British laws that predate our independence. Some of these laws are 500 years old and we cannot challenge them. So the work is ongoing. The work needs to happen. But more importantly, what we need to do now is community building. When we see what's happening with the divisions that are happening within our community, what we need to do now is community building. We need to fight misogyny. We need to fight racism. We need to fight transphobia. These things are not happening within our community. And unfortunately, it's because the leadership of the big LGBTQ plus organizations are white, cisgender, middle class, tertiary educated people who live very safe lives, earning great salaries in a safe office in London or Toronto or wherever they are in the global north. They do not face the challenges that we do as people of color, as queer people living on the margins of our own community. So this is where the work needs to be focused on now. How do we build our community back?
That's amazing. Thank you, Jason. I think you're such a wealth of knowledge and information. And I think that it's fascinating for me because when we're talking about legislation in the first place, and India was the first place that the British actually applied this criminal legislation. And it's really interesting for me that India was the first country where that happened because India was also the largest population and the biggest source of extraction of wealth for the colonizers as well. And so quite obviously the legislation was there to promote procreation. And so here we are trapped in this compulsory heteronormativity, heterosexuality, procreation, because human beings were capital, because this was pre-industrial revolution. And India funded that industrial revolution, right? So when we start thinking about, because for me, I'm a bit of a kid, so I kind of ask myself some really simple questions, like, why am I marginalized in the first place? What's the beef? Why would anyone have a problem with me for being beautifully melanated and from such a beautifully rich culture, or being queer? Why does that matter? And I think it always comes back to essentially procreation. And when we're looking at that, there's such a myopic kind of viewpoint when we're looking at what these battles are that we're in. And I think sometimes we have to kind of hark back to history, a pre-colonial history, to really identify and understand ourselves and be able to tap into that rich cultural background that we have. In terms of sort of accessing that, what do you feel is available to you? Because I consider myself very privileged to have access to religions, deities, gods, statues, archives, stories of the gods and stories that I was raised upon. In my family, because my mum's Hindu, and so I'm able to travel and see these places and read books and you study them, right? And I grew up with that genderqueer storytelling as a child, so to me it was just normal. And I can see that my parents and grandparents are victims of colonization and post-colonization. But for each of you, I'm really intrigued to know how you go about accessing that type of information. Can you access that information? If I can go to you first, Kay?
Yeah, it's interesting because for me, much like I'm a forfer, the Philippines also is a forfer, in that the United States, Japan, China, and Spain, just, Filipinx people are versatile because, and as a product of occupation by the US, by all of those spaces. So for me, what's interesting is, oftentimes, especially as a former kicked out person, former houseless, trans, non-binary person, right? My family was working class, very poor. I'll get white ass people, white ass cis gays, as dear Jason has mentioned, being like, oh yes, Asian culture or immigrant culture is so homophobic. And I was like, but this was all manufactured and brought. Like, something between us, there are trans parloristas, there are badings, there's a freaking, there's lesbians for national democracy. There's strapped trans people for national democracy. There are ways into which that the Philippines itself, as my homeland, right, as a person in the diaspora, has modeled beautifully and resiliently a culture where actually trans women and non-binary femmes were at the front and center. This is pre-Christianity, pre-Catholicism with the cross and the sword. So me knowing that, me accessing that, realizing that, the spiritual work that I've been ingrained is hybridized, is indigenized with Catholicism, but also with tribal inflections of the region I'm from. It's my duty. It's almost my visceral emotional response to challenge those things. And so when white cis supremacy combats at me and says, oh, XYZ, I'm like, wow, then that means you don't know about my story. That means what happens is the United States and white Spain came in and obliterated, right? The first thing you learn when the US came to the Philippines, when I was a trainer, was like, they take away your art, they take away your language, and they take away your education. And that is the architectural framework for colonization. So for me, I feel like if we're not understanding that there was collective work before myself, before my mother, before my Lola and grandma, that, we won't understand our queer histories. And that's part of the colonial white supremacist process, right? Like when people in the United States, it's very like, oh, Latinx are migrant, or Black people and African people, they're homophobic, and oh, Asian people, they're backwards. It is pinkwashing in so many ways, right? To say, oh, in Israel, which is actually Palestine, we're supporting, Jewish people support gays vacationing here, but you don't support Palestinian queer people. So it's very selective. And I think for me to harness those awarenesses is really critical to just, not even just breathing, but realizing I'm a part of something bigger. I belong to a network of not just storytelling, but political liberation.
That's massive. Thank you. Thank you, Kay. That was brilliant. Debbie, I want to move on to you next. Like, how do you go about accessing, the roots and that information? Can you access that? And how do you go about it?
Yeah, so mine's very similar to Kay in that part of pushing against this very white supremacist idea within to us LGBTQ communities is that our people are inherently homophobic. And having to like place a mirror in front of these folks being like, please explain what that means. And when like having to educate them, which we try not to do, it's like, I don't need to educate you for you to understand me, but it's almost like a response that I have to be like, you have no idea what it is like as a white cisgender dude who works at a nonprofit or the government here in Ottawa, because it's the capital city here in this country, understanding like where this idea comes from. And so for me, part of trying to reclaim those histories has been actively searching it. And I come from an oral tradition. And so I didn't know this as a young child, but like I often sought out the stories of older queer Black women and wanting to be in proximity to them just to hear their story. And then that quickly translated to me wanting to meet other queer Ghanaians or queer Africans to hear their story. And then recognizing that there are people who are, like myself, invested in this, in our liberation, who've been doing this work, who have been taking the time to unravel all of these hidden histories that are actively hidden to paint the story that, hey, did you know our traditional witch doctors back home are primarily depicted as genderqueer for a reason. They don't have wives, they don't have husbands, but they're very, very queer in their presentation. And like, why is that? And we even see this in our like popular culture through Gollywood, which is like our Ghanaian Hollywood, or even Nollywood, if you've ever watched Nigerian movies, very much so. You'll see like these people are queer coded for a reason. And then if you look back, you'll understand that like there was something about them blurring the lines of the gender binary that is never taught, unfortunately. And I understand why my parents never told me these stories, but like we're actively not taught to us for a reason. You know, and I'm hearing other stories of like women marrying women in certain tribes in Nigeria to this day. And where you know, there's art carvings in like caves in Zimbabwe where like Shona people have been like practicing this for a very, very long time. And so part of wanting to hear oral tradition and seeking out older queer women in particular, but then also taking the time to recognize that there are people who are Black Africans who've been doing this work to combat the idea that this has never happened, that we were never here before. And I think it's important to mention how the oral tradition is part of that, is because when Europeans were colonizing us, they said we had no history because it wasn't written down. But in actuality, yes, we do. And so I've been seeking this out, and it's been very important, especially what's happening in my home country right now. For those who don't know, in Ghana, there has been a bill presented to Parliament, the Family Values Bill, and it is extremely homophobic. But within the first page, there is nothing but visceral towards LGBTQ communities back home. And this has been a very interesting, insidious process. And this bill has roots to the fundamentalist, like religious right in the States. And we are now, as Ghanaian youth, reclaiming history to be like, you keep saying we were never here. You keep saying that Europeans just dropped queerness and transness in Ghana. We have proof. We have historians, our own people who've been talking about this and telling these stories. And it's an important way for us to even resist that as even diasporans. And so long-winded response to say that like it's always been important for me to hear these stories, to seek them out, and to also recognize that there are people who are actively archiving our histories throughout the entire continent. And it's been more useful now than ever in our political movements to take these histories and to show them in the face of people who are still upholding colonial ideas, and even in a decolonized process. Yes, we've been independent for 60 plus years, but there are people who were upholding very problematic things, including colonial era law, for their own benefit. And we just take that history and we're like, actually, you're wrong. So a little bit of a high try to do it.
That's amazing, Debbie. I think I completely, so much of that resonates with me as well, because it's personal research. And I think, you know, I have a book that is an archaeological study put together by a person in India who literally traveled around India and documented all of the statues that still exist and artworks that still exist because they're being defaced, right? And this has been happening for decades. They're being defaced so that the queerness is being erased from them, right? Because that's how deep this shame has become, is that we feel so shameful of our own queerness, right? But, you know, this book is now out of print, and the smaller independent publishing companies are going bust. So I have like one of the only copies, and it's not available digitally. And I'm kind of like, I feel like they're erasing our histories, and we are from oral storytelling culture. So how do we keep these archives alive? I don't know, Sen, if you have something to add to that in terms of your experience or any thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, as Debbie and Kay have so articulately put it, you know, what we're doing here is decolonizing our own imaginations when it comes to how we think about progress, liberation, and rights, and even our communities. Because, of course, you know, we know that colonization, French, Dutch, English, Spanish, you know, the forms of racialized slavery that ensued, indentured labor, created these transactional systems that essentially were about extracting culture, art, labor, life from individuals, while also seeking to brutally inscribe those individuals as savage, as repressed, as exotic. And we know there's so much written about this. And I think one of the really important moments that we're in now is about reframing this imaginary as, you know, the post-colonial nations as having, you know, shed off their colonial sort of vestiges, but also some of the Western nations talking about their own progress in these areas as if they are now far superior than those quote-unquote backwater, quote-unquote savage countries, which obviously they played a significant role in shaping. I think it's really important at this moment to first point out, you know, I'm a lawyer, that's my background. I teach human rights law, I do a lot of work on LGBT rights. And I always say to people, LGBT rights isn't homogenous, it's not universal. And actually, if we start breaking apart the letters just conceptually for a moment, we see that in many non-Western nations, trans rights and the rights of non-binary, genderqueer, people who don't conform to notions of gender or sex as we would typically describe them, actually have far more entrenched legal rights than they do here in the UK. You know, the whole point around self-declaration of one's gender has generated enormous political controversy in the UK. In fact, the legislation has now been shelved. And yet we've seen in places like Pakistan and India, don't get me wrong, their laws still need a lot of work. But they, you know, in principle, there is this idea that, yes, self-declaration is a way forward for people who are gender minorities, essentially. And so we see how that political toxicity does not exist there in this particular area when it comes to gender. Sure, when we're talking about sex and sodomy or buggery, there's far more sort of politicization around that. But it's really important when we even talk about our present to talk about how the histories and the memories that we have are also shaping sort of progressive politics as well, or the way in which a lot of countries and a lot of activists use this language of progress in really problematic ways. And I also think this is true of law. So much of the kind of LGBT NGO sector is built around sort of law and policy. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a problem in the sense that, you know, it is important to decriminalize homosexuality. It is important to have, you know, laws that affirm same-sex relationships, laws that affirm people's gender, policies that make it easier for people to travel and migrate with their partners. These sorts of things are enormously important. But at the same time, we see this overinvestment in law in a way that, you know, if we look back historically, a lot of societies were welcoming, embracing, and affirming of gender and sexual diversity without necessarily having formalized legal structures that define people's sexuality or gender in rigid ways. So part of what we're doing now is also, I think, to sort of read back through our culture, through our history, not in a sentimental way, because, you know, it's also important to say it wasn't like pre-colonial times was some sort of utopia for queers. You know, there were clear problems as well. But it is important to understand our history, understand our ancestry and where we come from in order to start rethinking our investments in the present. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And I'm seeing this with, you know, movements around decolonization, the fact that we're seeing so much more kind of airtime, if you like, given to queer and trans people of color, indigenous folks, Black folks, or global majority as the language is now, to reclaim the space that unfortunately has been dominated by a kind of neo-colonial white mentality. And, you know, even being in a forum like this is a kind of wonderful reminder of how we're articulating a lot of our issues in a way that's not necessarily against the dominant mainstream, but actually offering new visions and alternatives, which I think is really exciting. And that's why, you know, I see a lot of optimism in the archives and the storytelling that we have access to at the moment.
That's amazing. My brain's just buzzing because this is so amazing, and I just want to hear from you all forever. I think we're sort of running into the last sort of 10 minutes before we sort of move into some audience questions. But I guess there are a few bits that I just want to touch on quite quickly. But I do want to hear from you, Jason, in terms of how you feel that you've accessed your history, and how you think we can keep that alive. You know, what solutions you feel that we have.
Thank you so much. There are three things that I wanted to address from all of the sharing just before. Rita, you made such a powerful point, which was about procreation. What people don't realize is that Black and brown bodies were commodities for hundreds of years. So procreation was central to keeping that commodity and that resource happening over and over. The child of a slave became your slave. So what space did queer people have in indentured populations and enslaved populations? There was no space for queer people because we were not giving them new commodity, new workers. So that's a really key point about queer existences and why we were erased by our European colonizers. The next point I wanted to bring up was with Debbie, which you made such a powerful point about oral traditions. Another big part of Black and brown tradition is that our history is passed down orally. So when you have a situation like slavery or indentured laborship or HIV/AIDS, where you destroy the oral tradition being handed down, this is why queer people today don't know who we are or where we come from. You know, I come from a generation of men who were erased. I was very lucky that I was on the cusp. When I came out in 1982, it was just at the start of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So I was very lucky that I knew gay men who could pass on that tradition to me. And I stand on their shoulders, absolutely. The things that I have achieved are because of these powerful gay men that I knew. Also in Trinidad and Tobago, in the last 5 years, we've had multiple murders of gay men. A policeman with 20 years service of the police service came to me and said he suspects a serial killer is targeting gay men. I have spoken to the press. I've written to the Commissioner of Police. Nobody is doing anything about it. We've had serial killers in United Kingdom, Stephen Port. We've had serial killers in Toronto. I forget the man's name, Brian somebody. We are being hounded and murdered, and the security forces are doing nothing about it. Yesterday, an article came out in The Guardian about the rise in hate crimes against LGBT people. Gay man murdered in East London a week ago. So, you know, we are fighting a constant battle with these things. And the last thing that I wanted to share, just to answer Sen, my case was completely independent. No white LGBT organization in the world supported it. I funded it completely myself. All of my lawyers work pro bono. I work pro bono. I've raised every single penny for that case on my own. So when you talk about resources going to those things, I did it without any of the resources. So we need to start looking more precisely about strategy, what works and what doesn't work. When you see a float going down the Pride Parade and it's a bunch of white muscle Marys in gold pom-pom shorts, that has been going on for 10, 15 years. We don't see people of different bodies, people of different colors being centralized in the narrative of pride. That's where the change has to happen.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Jason. That was such a brilliant roundup. Such a great roundup. It's so powerful. We have it's probably quite a good time to take a short break. We have a 5-minute break, comfort break scheduled in. So if everyone's okay with that, we can take that now, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. See you then. Welcome back, everybody. Got the lovely Ross here. Hope you had a good little break. Right, we have about 20 minutes now for questions from the audience. I've got so many other things that I want to talk about with you all, and I'm just like, I want more time with you all. This has been so fabulous. Yeah, I'd love to do this again. I'd love to just see what else we can do. We definitely need this to be a series somewhere. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions in that I'm just gonna run through now. The first, I think there's a third one coming as well. So the first one is, a lot has been achieved regarding LGBT plus rights. We're looking at a positive trend. We also see countries like Hungary, Poland, and Romania adopting anti-LGBT plus laws. How do we, I think it's meant to say, how do we align legislation on a global level? It doesn't say who that's to, so anyone that wants to pick that up? Sen, do you want to go for that?
Sure. I mean, it was a law question, so I thought I would pick up on the legal aspects of that. I think just to really begin, what we're seeing in Poland, Hungary, we've seen in Brazil, we're seeing in India, we're seeing the politicization of LGBT rights, or what's now referred to as gender ideology. And so basically what we're witnessing is the way in which governments are now weaponizing the visibility of LGBT people, their communities, their families, in order to further a very narrow right-wing agenda, essentially, in order to kind of, as we were talking about earlier, protect a very specific idea of hetero reproduction and whiteness in particular. So it's also important for me to flag that a lot of these kind of debates and politics around gender ideology are very much bound up in anti-immigrant sentiment and racism that we see in the border policing around the world as well. I mean, a place like Hungary, for example, has one of the most callous border regimes. I mean, there were reports only, a couple of years ago of border guards shooting at people trying to cross the border to seek asylum. And so I think when we talk about issues, it's important that we understand their unique political context, but also the transnational political context, which is why I think Pride is so important, because it allows us this opportunity for this transnational conversation to say that it's not just about one law in this country changing. Yes, there's a really bad law, the Polish anti-LGBT zones, or Hungary's refusal to allow people to change their gender marker on their legal documents, or Brazil's kind of clamp down on the teaching of LGBT education or anything to do with LGBT people in schools and universities, but actually to understand those broader political forces. Because I think if we can organize collectively around challenging those broader politics, it eliminates these laws from existing in the first place. So I think that's why this kind of global solidarity work is so important, and organizing work is so important. More so, I would say, than individual kind of targeted law reform, as important as that is. And I would hope that there are people doing that important work. But I think it would be a mistake to just assume that, we can do it section by section without fully understanding that broader picture.
Okay, thanks. And do you want to go, Kay?
Yeah, just really quickly, just from my context, there's just this rash, this heated educational policy happening to young trans and non-binary people in the United States on a statewide level, but also that's also interconnected with a lot of anti-sex worker policy. And we know, as people who can't survive in the white productivity infrastructure, that sex work, right, is really pivotal. So they are attacking migrants. That's a lot of trans and queer people, right? Creating an independent or collective economy. And then a lot of disabled people who can't do 9-to-5 work. So a lot of these policies that people don't think on the surface level of white supremacy aren't queered, or aren't BIPOC, or aren't migrant, definitely are. And when it comes to trans young people being targeted, there are very few freedoms that trans young people have, and even the US medical industrial complex. I know we're privileged, and then there are parts where it's completely dehumanized and terrifying. And so to even be on an educational level and not be able to play a sport, right? Or not to go to the bathroom on a very surface level teaches other young people, other white supremacists in their youth, that this is okay to create and maximize, as what everyone has been referring to, this homogenous, heteronormative, binary white system. So tackling, again, education, and then also tackling just the idea of sex as work impacting so many in our community, specifically poor people and working class people.
Yeah, massively, 100% agree with everything that you're saying there. Absolutely. I'm really glad that you brought that up as well. Debbie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I really like this question because we're looking at, I would call them like just the global hate movements and how they operate from the state level, but also individual. Just inspired by what Kay mentioned, of course, we share a very large border with the United States, and often Canada loves to position itself as being morally superior to the United States, that we don't have a racism problem, they do. We aren't homophobic, they are. We legalized gay marriage before the Americans, everything's fantastic. But what is often missing from that is how information, like what are borders in the world when we have information that can cross as quickly as me sending a WhatsApp message. This also resonates when it comes to anti-trans sentiments for youth that we are seeing creep up in the most insidious way here in Canada. And I want to specifically pay attention to anti-trans movements that are coming from TERFs, which are trans exclusionary radical feminists. Canada exports, it likes to pride its exports in being maple syrup and wood, but we also export white supremacists who are TERFs and also Proud Boys, some of the biggest leaders within the global movement that is spreading to countries like Hungary and spreading to countries like my own are Canadian. And that's something I think important to name, especially in a country who is built on this myth of being the most supportive, inclusive, better than the US. It's important for me to note that we are also exporting that, but it also at the same time taking what's happening from across the world and trying to influence it here in our own country. And in the context of a federal election, we go to vote on September 20th. It's extremely scary when we're looking at polling and our conservative government, or not our conservative government, our government is currently liberal, but the conservative opposition is looking like they might form either a minority government in a couple of weeks. And it's extremely scary when the people who have those anti-trans, very white supremacist sentiments, who are exported, like, leaders across the world, find home within the conservative government in our country. And so I just wanted to add that it's extremely global. And I think we need to also contextualize how our own countries support these things across the world, and at the same time, draw inspiration from it as well.
That's amazing. That's brilliant. I think we've got, I'm really conscious of time. We're down to the last sort of 5 or 6 minutes now. I guess what I'd like to do is actually just address the latest question that's come in, which is reflecting on everything you've discussed today. How would you describe the power of pride today? There was actually a question that I wanted to bring up that's related to this to sort of close off on anyway, so it's really perfect. And that's really about how we can decolonize the global pride movement, essentially. I'd love to just hear just a minute from each of you, if I may, on how you feel. What does pride mean today? And I think that, obviously there are very specific voices that are answering this question, and we're seeing lots of shifts and changes as we've briefly touched upon. But what do you think the power of pride is today? Where are we going to take it? Because it's really up to us, right? Can I start with you, Debbie?
Absolutely. When I think of the question, both questions, the power of pride, but then also decolonizing pride movements, I'm honestly drawing a lot of my inspiration from what happened in Canada. In 2016, in Toronto Pride, Black Lives Matter Toronto, which was led primarily by Black women, Black queers, Black trans folks, stopped the biggest pride parade in our country for 30 minutes to present demands predicated on the fact that we needed to see more respect for queer and racialized people. We also needed these spaces to be safe, and having police officers who are in part tools of the state to inflict violence on our people is honestly disgusting. And so I draw inspiration from that because I saw what happened globally as a result of that. So one thing Canada exported that I think was really cool was that we saw subsequent movements of people stopping pride parades to make the same demands. And this is in the 2010s, so we're talking about a time where the internet and access to social media was so different, where everyone got to see what happened. And I think it's important when we're going to talk about decolonizing, but then also the power of pride. The power of pride right now is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because if you really want to decolonize, especially for countries like the UK, US, Canada, who are part of this global movement that hold so much power. You need to pay up and you need to step back. And those two things to me are crucial if we're going to do this. There are reparations that need to be paid, even within things like Manchester Pride, Capital Pride, to activists on the ground who are dealing with a different level of violence as a result of the colonization from the countries that we currently occupy. And so I really think being uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, recognizing that even within our own pride movements locally, power needs to be changed. We need to center the people who've been marginalized, but then also globally recognizing that there are people who might meet their activists who are doing work that we can learn something from. And I think if we're in a position to support them, even financially, do it. So there's that step back, pay up mentality that I think is really crucial. And that's how that's like the basic way for us to be able to see the power of pride, but then also to decolonize it.
Step back and pay up. I love it. I love it. Like, so much great stuff in there. Kay, is there something you'd like to add as well?
Yeah, I think what's really important to me is to make all of pride accessible and to center. I'm not interested in a politics of recognition. Like, I'm usually the only disabled person or the only trans person. And that doesn't do anyone any justice. What I'm interested in is an ultimate cultural shift and a pivotal moment where we only center BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, where we center migrants, disabled people, Muslim people, non-Christian folks. And I think if we shift from that and really make everything truly accessible, because even in the United States, it's a bunch of able people and disabled BIPOC are like, hey, could you have ASL? Hi, could you have this, active description? Even on that base level, if you can't meet people, if you can't meet poor, disabled, migrant folks where they are, trans people where they are, there's not going to be an liberation. It's just a fake ass party at that point, right? So just be honest about that selfishness. I think exactly what Debbie has said is, I am really calling that white, cis, gay, liberal people who are comfortable to really try to relinquish their privilege, to resource Black and trans initiatives, undocumented and trans queer initiatives, disabled queer trans initiatives. Because until that happens, the rainbow flag that's just up outside my building means nothing. It is a blanket promise that doesn't encourage, I don't need a rainbow flag in a gay bar. My people need housing, healthcare, and not to be policed or incarcerated by ICE, right? That's what I need. So fuck that flag. It's very pretty now, but it doesn't call for my safety. It actually is the boot that's choking my people on my neck sometimes. It's that white glittery boot. So just move that boot, whatever you paid for with it, give it to Black and Indigenous people and give it to disabled people so that we can live. Because I promise you, our world will be more collective when we do that. It'll be beautiful. It already is. You just don't want to see it.
100%. Amazing. Thank you, Kay. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I'd get a minute from each of you as well. Jason, would you like to go next?
I just want to echo everything that Kay and Debbie have said. And, I really want people who are listening this afternoon to realize that we're not bashing white people. I'm half white myself. So, this is not about bashing white people. It's talking about structures of power and where you have access to resources. For us, as queer people of color, we don't have access. We don't sit on the boards of these organizations. We don't sit at the head table of prides and NGOs. We're not there making the decisions. So we need to be put there. Lady Phil Opuku, is the first person of color to lead an international LGBT organization in the world. And, this happened 2 years ago. That's ridiculous. Ridiculous. For 50 years, the first person of color to sit at the top of the table for an LGBT organization is Phil Opuku. And bravo, Phil, and I love you so much, my dear. So we need to start getting places at the table, right? I'm not about dismantling the table. I'm about getting us sitting there because the table exists. But what we also have to recognize is that how we move forward as a community, right now we are incredibly fractured. How we move forward as a community is a key element of how we dismantle all of the all of the ideas of discrimination, whether it be discrimination because you're disabled, differently abled, or your race or your gender, whatever these things are. Unless we come together as a community, we cannot change these things. So I implore everybody, find a way to get involved. I, as an activist, I have never been paid a salary. I have never gone to a university. I have never done anything. I'm not a professional. I'm nobody. I'm just a simple guy who was fed up of being treated dismally by my family and by the wider community. The day that I won my case at the High Court of Trinidad and Tobago, I was being interviewed by the press on the steps of our High Court, and somebody walked past and shouted faggot at me. This is how we live. And the only way we're going to change this is by coming together as a community. So community building is the forefront of our advocacy right now.
100% agree with that. Thank you so much, Jason. And Sen, if we can just close off with you on this.
Sure, and I just want to echo everything Debbie, Kay, and Jason has said. And I also want to point out that pride is multiple, it's plural. We all have different imaginings of pride. We all participate in different kinds of prides. There are corporate prides, there are local community prides, there are grassroots prides, there are Black prides, there are dyke prides, there are Muslim prides. I think it's so important that we talk about all of these prides that we build, rather than to try and imagine some sort of unique universal pride, which often just goes back to kind of corporate and sort of, structural ideas of what a pride is or should be. And I think for a lot of people, we yearn for a pride that's accessible and inclusive, and we should have that. And I think, we need to hold space for criticism, and Manchester Pride is no stranger to that. We've got protests happening this weekend, and I think it's incumbent on any organization, and I speak that from myself as someone who's also now ascended, if you like, to a high position in a governance role within a major human rights organization, is that we need to hold space for criticism as part of our accountability. And that is something that's really difficult to do, and it's especially difficult when you often feel like you're, torn between competing ideas and competing visions. But to use the table metaphor that Jason so beautifully put earlier, get seats at the table and build new tables. We have to have this kind of multiple approach to thinking about pride and solidarity. And of course, right now, around the world, we're seeing huge humanitarian disasters. There was the earthquake in Haiti a couple of weeks ago. And of course, we've now seen the rise of the Taliban now that the former Afghanistan government has collapsed, and seeing so many pleas from people who are internally displaced, LGBTQ folks who are deeply concerned for literally their lives and their liberties. And I think it's so important that we talk about building humanitarian space, about changing the asylum system. And people need to know that Pride is not a moment. It is not a weekend. It is not a party that you go for. I mean, these are all great and wonderful things, but you can hold space for this throughout the entire year in any way you can. It's not that you need to do everything. I'm lucky. I get paid to do a lot of what I do, but a lot of people don't have that luxury. But where you have resource, think about how you distribute that, and do so through conversation, through dialogue, through community building. And remember, criticism is an act of when done well, is an act of generosity. It's an act of love. It's about making sure we can all build the community that we want, rather than trying to tear things apart, right? So that's what I want to sort of end on.
Thank you so much, Sen. I think that was a brilliant place to end on. Great timing, everybody. I think we got a lot of words per minute in. Well done, everyone. I'm so impressed. Thank you to all of you. There's going to be a break now, and then we're moving into the second panel this afternoon with Ben Peachy. But I just really want to thank you all. You've been an absolute joy, and I'm just really excited to speak to you all more and see what else we're able to do. So thank you to the amazing panelists. Thank you to Russ, who's been working really hard at hyperspeed to keep up with us. And also thank you to all of you who have been listening and watching. I think following everybody that's here across social media and just trying to keep the conversation going would be really, really fantastic. And I just think watch this space. I think that it's fantastic that these conversations are happening, and I'm just glad that there's a platform available for us to do that, even amongst all the controversy which we've touched upon as well. And I think that is really a sign of the times that we're in too. So thank you all of you. We're going to take a break now for about 20 minutes, and then we're moving into the second half of the afternoon. Blessings to you all. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this second panel of Manchester Pride's Human Rights Forum. Whether you're joining live right now or if you are watching later, we are so happy that you are here with us today. Thank you so much to Rita and all the other panelists. I feel like I have some very large shoes to fill, and of course, to the wonderful Russ for doing an incredible job. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you are joining us just for the second panel and you weren't here for the first one, we do have an interpreter on screen for you. And also we will pop in the chat again where you can go and join with live captioning. Also, another little bit of housekeeping. Unfortunately, Sean Fay is not able to join us today due to some pesky technical difficulties. But don't worry, it just means more time for questions. And I will also be jumping in on some questions to give you a little bit of peace of my mind. Just a little bit about me. My name is Ben Peachy. My pronouns are they, them. A little visual description of me. I'm sat in a green cactus haven. I am white. I have mid-length blonde hair. I have an obscene amount of makeup on, and I'm wearing a muted rainbow floral dress, which I actually purchased from reality television's Gemma Collins on Depop. A little bit of background about me. I'm a writer, speaker, presenter, and diversity and inclusivity consultant. When I work with brands as an influencer, I sort of Trojan horse my way into very traditional cisgender settings to bring queer visibility and validity to audiences. When I work with brands as a consultant, I bring lived experience, research, and education to disrupt and alter corporate thinkings and behaviors. I am so excited to be here with you today and some incredible panelists to discuss queerness as resistance. Over the next 40 minutes to an hour, we will be exploring how LGBTQI+ identities and experiences have been steeped in resistance against the norms set by society and how we can continue to break down those barriers and boundaries to create what might be more of an equitable world. We're going to be looking at the concept of normal and what authenticity means and looks like in 2021, in Pride season, and of course, beyond. Throughout this panel, if you have questions, we obviously want to hear from you. Make sure that you are dropping those in the chat box to the side, and we will get to you at the end when we do the Q&A. I am so excited to welcome two incredible panelists today. We have the wonderful Monica Pearl and the incredible Mark Thompson, who I would love to say hello to. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Look at this gorgeous modern screen. We can see everyone. We are coming from across the UK today. I'd love you both to introduce yourselves, give us a little bit of visual introduction. So we'll start off with Mark. Where are you? It's a bit like blind date. Where are you from? Never mind. Don't worry about that. But yeah,
what's your name and where you're from? Hi,
there you go. I've got nicer teeth than Stiller.
It's so lovely to be here. Hi, everybody. So my name is Mark Thompson. My pronouns are he, him. I am calling in from the People's Republic of Brixton in South London. Quick visual description for you. I'm a middle-aged black man. I have short black hair, silver pepper beard, mostly still more salt than pepper. I'm wearing a white New York Yankees baseball top with blue stripes from the New York Yankees in homage to Mary J. Blige. And in my living room, I've got a kind of dark bluish background with lots of art on the walls and plants and the blinds. And that's me. And I am the co-director of the Love Tank, a community interest company that works to serve underserved communities through health promotion, advocacy, and research. I've worked in and around HIV and sexual health and community building for almost 30 years now, creating organizations such as Blackout and Big Up, and I'm the co-founder of Prepster. And a little bit like yourself, Ben, I like to be a disruptor. I kind of describe myself as a cultural curator and disruptor. I like to cause trouble in the community because I think that's how we shape things up and we get results. But I also do it through fun, love, to try to engage people. So my battle is always around kind of moving around obstacles to make great stuff. So it's a real delight to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Oh, what an honor. And Monica, it would be gorgeous to find out where you are and all the incredible things that I know that you do.
Hi, I'm Monica Pearl, and I am speaking to you from Manchester, so deeply in the city centre that pride is happening around me, which is why I'm putting my mic on mute in between, because there's a lot of sound, prideful sound happening around. I'm in my flat wearing a bright blue collar button-down shirt with American dark, maybe 1950s dark glasses, boy glasses, with short spiky hair. And there's some flowers behind me and a little bit of trees from the outside, big windows. I am senior lecturer in 20th century American literature and film at the University of Manchester, but I'm a former member of ACT UP New York. I was involved in ACT UP in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And another thing that I do now is, before lockdown, I was conducting a queer salon in Manchester, which is a public sort of event for talking about provocative ideas and concerns in the queer world. And I'm very much hoping to return to that once it's possible again.
Wow. What a pair of panelists who are literally changing the world. I guess as we enter into this panel discussion, I think it would be really interesting if we could explore maybe the similarities and differences in the way that we work as activists, as educators, and maybe as we sort of talk about the similarities, the differences, and the benefits of a differing approach. Monica, I come to you. Sort of, how do you see, sort of, from the world of academia versus the sort of medical disruption going through that way, the differences? How do you reflect on that?
Do you mean the differences between sort of academia and activism?
Or just the way that there's differences in the way that you work versus the way that Mark works versus the way I work. However you want to interpret and answer the question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I'd like to hear more about how Mark works, and I can think more about those differences. But, you know, one of the things that I think about what I do in academia is similar to what I did in activism, though there are important differences, and I can speak about those later. But the similarities are trying to give agency and capacity to people to make their own critical interventions and decisions in the world. So this is something that we fought for as activists, to have the right to make our own decisions based on informed consent. And I suppose education now in academia, my goal, my intervention is very, very similar in that regard.
And Mark, the things that you do, how do you think that differs from sort of sitting down within the world of academia?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, Monica's raised those points straight away, because that's exactly what I do in my work. My work, from the very first day I got involved in HIV prevention in the late 80s and early 90s, probably around the same time you got involved in ACT UP, Monica, was around giving people the tools and the information and the skills, therefore empowering them and enabling them to make decisions and choices for themselves. I was never ever about telling people what to do, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. We knew that people just needed the answers to make their own decisions. But then coupled with that was also giving people the tools, not just to make informed choices, but then to make them activists as well, so they could stand up either within their own communities, to the system. So I think if we look at the work that we've done with Prepster in the past 5 or 6 years, our initial goal was to give information out to the community. But very similar to taking the ACT UP model, which my co-founder, Will Nutland, was a member of ACT UP in the UK, we really wanted to ensure that the community that we were giving information to were able to agitate for PrEP access. So how could they engage with their MPs? And so there was always an interlink between what we were doing grassroots, what we were doing with academia, what we were doing with government. We always like to call it smart activism. We can get out, we can raise lots and lots of banners and placards and scream and shout, but actually we want to have a seat around the table to make those differences as well. And I think the additional thing that I'm really keen to be doing as I get older and I spend more and more time in the game is a mentoring role. So I'm much more now involved in passing the baton down to younger queer activists to do the stuff that we've been doing for many, many years. I'm not hanging up the boots just yet, but it's a real kind of pleasure to take on a mentoring role as well as the kind of standard education stuff that I've been doing for quite a while.
It's clear that, you know, wherever you are in this industry, it's very similar, the roles in which you engage with the community, the society that you have to act within. It's really, really interesting. And looking at sort of how I came into activism, it was really for me having nothing to base an existence upon. I came into this world and I really felt isolated from the world around me, and I began to sort of explore activism in about sort of 2015, 2016, when I realized there just wasn't anything there that reflected my trans non-binary identity. I felt incredibly lost, and I actually realized that that was sort of the world saying to me, you need to be that voice for someone else. And that's how I've sort of worked. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned having that seat at the table. Now I feel like, because my job as I get more opportunities and sort of possibilities, is now I've got sort of like a side seat at that table, is pulling out more chairs for other people. I think there are certain parts of activism that's very much about, well, I've got my seat, so I'm done now. And I think it's really interesting that we've all said it's about giving more and carry on and going deeper into generational activism. I think it's very, very interesting. I guess sort of a developmental point from that, and I'll come to you on this one, Mark. What does sort of the term queer mean to you? I mean, we've obviously looked at that in terms of making radical social change that explores healthcare and how people feel able to exist in the world. But what do you think that differs to, first of all, how society views us as a community, but also what you think we're supposed to be versus what it actually looks like?
I've had a very interesting relationship with queer, the word queer, and it's evolved over the years. I'm a man of a certain age, a certain generation, so as many people can imagine, that my relationship to queer has been problematic for many years because it was a term of abuse in many, many years. But then when it was being reclaimed in the early 90s, I again didn't associate myself with it. I felt it was very white. I thought it was very radical, which I wasn't necessarily occupying the world. I often tell people it felt very much like a Gus Van Sant movie. That's what queer represented to me. So it didn't feel like it fit for me. But when I started to do work at Blackout, when we created Blackout in 2016, we had lots of discussions around the word queer and where we were working with black men or black queer men. And then after lots of discussion, we recognized that the word queer was a completely inclusive word for all of the different shades and diversity that we were as same gender loving people. And then for me, as a black gay man, I now fit myself into what I see as the queer family. I am a gay man of a certain age and a certain generation with certain experiences, and I sit within this wonderful family, which is made up of people who are queer, who are lesbian, who are trans, who are non-binary. So it's a wonderful rainbow. And I think that that allows us to be beautifully different. And also it allows us to be really radical and to kick back still, because, you know, it's like the N word. You can't call us queer unless you're part of the party, right? So there's all of that, which I still really love. But I'm still the Donna Summer, Barbara Streisand loving gay man. So I sit within that kind of pattern, really.
And the same again to you, Monica. What does queer mean to you today?
Well, as a Barbara Streisand loving American white Jewish middle-aged woman, dyke, I've thought a lot about queer, and you know, queer has so many complicated origins and places that it lives now, and of course, it comes out of activism. You know, queer comes from Queer Nation, an activist group that emerged out of ACT UP, the AIDS activists organization, and it comes out of demands. It comes out of fighting. It comes out of, as Mark alluded to, claiming that slur, that term, from the people who were trying to use it against us. It also now, of course, is connected to queer theory, something that is very meaningful to me as an academic. But it has to exist in both those worlds, an activist world and a theory academic world, and it's very much connected. You can't just use it in one of those. And one of the things that queer is, well, I'll say two of the things that queer is. It's always connected to the body and to sex. I think sometimes we disengage it from the ways that it's about bodies and sex and desire. But it is also about conflict and challenge and irresolution. You know, those origins of queer that come from, say, feminism and intersectionality and, you know, the Black queer women of the Combahee River Collective who came up with the idea of intersectionality before it was that word. It is not being able to land somewhere and know the answer or know exactly what that word means or what it refers to, because it's always in flux and it's always being challenged, and it's a project that doesn't have an end point to it. So that's really hard to hold on to, but I think it's really important to remember those two things. It's about the body and about sex, and it's about things that don't always feel comfortable or fixed or done.
And I think I'm really glad you mentioned Queer Nation there, Monica, because I'd forgotten just for a minute there how that it had stemmed from that movement. And in the UK, even as it was a period, as much as I wasn't holding on to the word queer, I was going to a club called Queer Nation in London every single week, which adopted the name and the movement. But it was also a space which adopted the ethos of inclusivity, of diversity, which our queer community at the time certainly wasn't following, was very much siloed into cis men, cis women, trans people were just about getting a look in. And Queer Nation as a dance movement in this country became a banner for inclusivity and fun and diversity. So it was taking those activist roots again and putting those onto the dance floor for many of us to access and to be free in ways that we probably wouldn't have been.
Yeah, and I love that you say the dance floor, because it also refers to a literal dance floor. You know, that's what we were doing in between protests and demonstrations, is we were going to clubs and we were going to bed with each other, and we were, you know, it's physical, right? It's physical. It's also about pleasure and joy as much as it's about shame and disappointment, which is seen as the obverse of pride, but it's not. It's attached. It always goes with it. But yes, the dance floor, very important part of queerness and pride.
I think what's so incredible is, you know, coming through in a different generation, I've been bequeathed this gift of the freedom of queerness. You know, none of that work was mine. You know, I was able just to come into it, and I had all this incredible work done for me. And I think, you know, when we talk about some of the contention around queerness, it's very much still that conversation that queerness isn't acceptable to everyone. And I think that's when we talk about freedom, it's also really interesting that we don't own the narrative of what a word can mean to someone. And when we talk about queerness, sometimes that's just someone saying, I don't know where I am right now, but queer seems to be really comfortable. But for other people, we're looking at, you know, 10, 15 years worth of trauma, and we just don't know what we're opening up when we talk about queerness. And that's why it's so interesting, multifaceted. But that's also why things like this and a wider celebration of Pride is important, because there's still so many stories unearthing that are coming to fruition right now, because we're still developing and growing as people. And that's why it's so exciting. And I, you know, when people ask me how I feel about queerness, to me it's magical, because you don't know where that journey's going, and also you don't know where that person's been. And that's why they say queer, because it's pain, but it's also pleasure, and it's magic. That's, you know, so interesting. And I think sort of on a personal level, it would be really interesting to look at, you know, how being queer, feeling queer, existing as queer informs our perspective of the world, you know, perhaps in a unique way to yourself, but also, you know, the societal norms around you. I'll come to you, Monica, first. You know, how does that affect your perspective on the world, but also like the relationship with the world that we have to exist within?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, you know, it is a very comfortable place sometimes, Ben, as you say, the queer world that we've built, and now we can rest in it. But it's not only not a comfortable place everywhere, but it's not even a word everywhere that's comfortable. And internationally, a lot of people are using the word queer to have a way to plug in and to communicate with each other and across borders and across nations, but queer isn't necessarily the word that works or even a word that's translatable. So they're using literally the English word queer in order to signal something that might not feel authentic. So, and in some ways that fits into the paradoxes of queerness itself, right? It is a shorthand for something. So I know that I want to find my queer people when I'm moving around the world, whether it's within England, within North America, or internationally. You know, you want to find your queer people, and that's a really lovely way to navigate the world. But it's not possible for everyone to find that shortcut. And so I'm going to be missing a lot if that's my only lens.
And to you, Mark, what's your take on that? You know, how does queerness and the thought of queerness inform who you are as a person?
Well, you know, I think for a jump off, it's made me a better person. My gayness and my queerness has made me a much better person. It opens my eyes to a world which I may not have experienced if I didn't exist in this world, if I wasn't this person. And even before I, you know, adapted and accepted the word queer and the notion of it as a gay man, that gave me a certain amount of freedom, and a black gay man is that, to shake off shackles of masculinity, of things that were holding me back. So there, on a really deeply personal level, my queerness has opened doors for me. It's opened my eyes to arts and culture that I may not, it's allowed me to enjoy things which I otherwise may have put restrictions on myself enjoying. So once I accepted my sexual identity as a really young man, I could frame all of the things that I loved and I enjoyed. But it's also made me a kind of better person, because I understand, as a black man, I understand oppression, you know, because I live that every single day. As a positive man, I understand that. And a gay man. So those intersections, if I'm suffering them, then that should hopefully, and because the way that I've been raised as well, so I think it's really important that I throw that in there. My queerness didn't just make me a nice guy, right? Because there are some problematic queers in the world, as there are problematic cis people, right? But what it's enabled me to do is to understand, actually, we're all going through a load of stuff in this. And if I'm feeling this oppression, then I need to do something to fix that. And there's a kind of standard line that the oppressed can sometimes become the oppressors. And my queerness has enabled me to just be kinder, gentler, more understanding. And I'm really glad that Monica has raised that issue around the international perspective, because now I'm able to actually connect the dots and go, okay, well, I have a huge amount of privilege. My family accepted me, my community accepted me. So what do I do with that? So I can now connect to other people around the world and utilize that in a really good way.
I think that's really interesting, because when you say the word privilege, actually, I sometimes think we forget that privilege actually equals power. And what we see in terms of the conversation around privilege is it's getting stuck in a very few simple narratives. And what it actually allows us to do is how much access we have to certain resources, both socially and economically, that exists within us. And I think I am very aware of the privilege and thus the power that comes with being in certain interactions with my own identity. Of course, I exist in the trans community, but I'm also white. I also come from quite a middle-class background. These are things that can coexist, but they also give me leverage and access to certain parts that certain members of my community can't. And so every time I think to myself, oh goodness, being queer or being trans or being non-binary, that's okay, is a moment for me to go, okay, but who is that not okay for? And what do I need to be doing to ensure that I can transfer some of this access, if not all of it, some of it, to others? And it's all about thinking. Sometimes we forget that we always want to move forwards, but we have to think about what's going on at the side of us, what's going on over there and over there. And that's thinking about power. And I think that's really, really interesting. And it moves us on quite nicely. We're talking about queerness as resistance, and a big part of resistance is subversion. And how does that show up in your activism, or how does it inform your work? I'll come to you first, Mark.
Oh, I found this one a little bit challenging to kind of think about, because I suppose because I live in this little bubble, I don't always feel like I'm being that subversive, but I think just by my simple existence, of being a Black queer man who has HIV, who's unapologetic about all of those things and draw no quarter for them, right? At all. That allows me to be subversive. My very existence isn't meant to be. I am meant not to be, I'm not meant to be confident and proud and to shout about those things. I'm not meant to be friends with you, Ben. I'm not meant to make connections with Monica. But the fact that I do that and I live that and I breathe that is absolutely essential to me. So I think, and often, I often talk about the term Black boy joy, right? And the reason I talk about Black boy joy so often, or Black men loving Black men being a revolutionary act, I think that's a more powerful statement by Joseph Bean. It's this powerful statement because it's subversive and radical because we are taught not to. And I think if we expand that lens out to all of our queer community, the simple fact that we are here today loving, being kind, being generous, fighting, our existence is subversive.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think we think that being subversive is going out and doing things, but a lot of us can just exist and really shake things up. And that really leans into your past, Monica. I'm sure you have some incredible insight on this.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about how activism is always about using privilege. I mean, not everyone has the same amount of privilege, but being an activist and putting yourself on the street, whether it's just to protest or to raise your voice or to give support to other people who are doing that, is about acknowledging that you have a certain kind of privilege that can be spent on being in the street. It doesn't mean getting arrested necessarily, but it does mean being visible and, risking some of your time and some of your freedom. Freedom is the main theme of the panels today, and it's hard to know what that is. But one of the things is to not just acknowledge freedom, but to actually use it when you have it. And one of the things that I did have to think about when I was risking arrest doing activism and ACT UP is what can happen to me. And as a white woman, I felt a kind of, not an obligation, but maybe an opportunity to be able to risk things that others around me, others working with me, would be far more anxious about for good reason. So even though it's scary to get arrested and it's scary to be in jail and it's very scary to face up against the legal system, I really felt, one, supported by ACT UP as a whole, but also that I had that privilege to be able to face the system and to spare some of that privilege for fighting for things that I really believed in. And that's me talking not as someone who was trying to, the other thing that I think is really important about when we think of ourselves as either as activists who are committed to activism is how we're doing it for ourselves, right? Activism is a selfish act. It's not only about doing things out of solidarity and for other people. It's about improving your own health, well-being, world circumstances, and life. So I think that's really important. It makes you feel better to fight for the things that you believe in.
Here. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because we don't really talk about that often as activists, right? And I was just reflecting recently that so much of my activism has been deeply personal. I got into the game because I didn't want people to experience what I had experienced, and it made me feel better when they didn't. And as one gets older and the fights and the battles shift, one starts to think, okay, so what am I personally invested in now? So as an older activist, you start to think, okay, the young'uns seem to have this, they've got it, they've got it. So our fights start to shift a little bit. And this is when the mentoring becomes so much more important. And also, Monica, I'm really glad you said that, because there were so many years where, as a Black man, I wouldn't protest because I couldn't afford the risk of being arrested or taken to jail. So, blessings to you and peace for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I often say to students and to young people is that if you are suffering with anxiety or depression or any kind of social discomfort, that is real, and I take it seriously, and you are facing a challenge. But one of the ways to well, to fix that, I'm going to say it, just one of the ways to fix that or to ameliorate that is to do protest and activism and to get involved. It actually will not just make the world better. It's not an altruistic act to do activism. It is a very selfish act. And it's important to also remember that there are two reasons and outcomes to do activism. One is to make change the world, and the other is to create solidarity.
Yeah.
And when you do an action and you feel disappointed because you didn't get the thing that you were fighting for, you didn't get the thing you wanted, well, you did get something. You got that high of being in a group of people fighting for something, and you are then closer. You have burnished your skills. You have a better idea of how to do it next. You have a better idea of how to pass it on to others. So this is, one of my, important things that I would like to leave people with, is that getting involved, and it doesn't have to be shouting in the street. It could be, doing something in an enclosed space together, writing letters or changing a sign on something to say something a little more enlightened. It will benefit you.
I think that's really interesting. It doesn't have to be these huge, big gestures. Through COVID, it was very interesting on how do we create action when we can't physically exist in a space together. And it was really interesting that the amount of people that were really utilizing something that has existed in the UK for a very long time is the ability to write to your MP. Now, over a grand scheme of things, does it do that much? Not currently with the government we're faced in. I'd like to keep this politically neutral, not that it can be. But it's one of those things that, over time, you can create noise in different ways. And that's really interesting. And I've never thought about it like that before, Monica. It makes you feel good to help other people. And, it's really important that we call that selfishness. And I would just like to preface that with being selfish is not a bad thing when we exist in a world that would quite happily take everything from us in a heartbeat. Selfishness to not only help yourself, but to create solidarity and bring us up is really, really important.
Not being selfish is short-sighted.
Can we just write that down? And then that's just what we need to say for the rest of it. That was beautiful. That was powerful. I can think that could be the title of a thesis, a book, a TV series. I want to listen to that podcast. Incredible. I think we've talked a lot about the things we're doing. I think it would be really interesting to look at this from sort of a historical point of view, but also a current point of view. I'll come to you first on this one, Monica. What do you think right now are the goals of queer resistance? What are we trying to achieve here?
That's a tough one. It really is. It's really hard to step away from assimilationist goals where it looks like a lot of our more radical aspirations from the past have been subverted or given up for, say, things like marriage equality. And I think we have to connect queerness. No, I don't want to say connect it. To see the ways that queerness is already encompassing so many other issues, like immigration, like climate change, like fighting a government that you might not agree with or agree with all its policies. So for all that I've said that queerness is about bodies and about sex and about desire, bodies and sex and desire are connected to really all those other things. So I'm not sure how to answer that question, because there are things that we must fight for around queer. And also it's hard sometimes to, especially in a pride scenario where it can feel like, no one cares anymore about fighting for social justice. People want to have a good time. Well, having a good time, as I've stressed, very much, is part of the fight, but it has to be part of it. It has to be part of the fight. So I struggle with that. How do we reconcile those things? What do you think, Mark?
I mean, I'm with you, and there's, again, it's really difficult to throw age into this sometimes. I'm not too sure because I'm not on the ground, right? But I do agree that I think that first of all, there is a kind of the bigger stuff which is going on in the world right now, which we need to ensure that there is a queer eye on it, that we are influencing, we're talking about that. In the same way, if we talk, let's take climate change, for example. In Black political movements, we are talking about the impact of climate change on Black and brown communities. And so there is a real notion that we need to make sure that the queerness is injected into that as well. As much as we have won lots of fights, I love the word that you use around assimilation. And I do worry sometimes that because we've won those fights, that many people who just want to live a simple life, come out to their families, they see themselves on soap operas and TV, can get married and have 2 kids and have a nice house and buy into the capitalist dream, it's all done. But when we unpick that, we see that there's been a huge rise in the UK recently of homophobic hate crime. We're seeing attacks in our gay centres. We're seeing this happen globally. So I think, I'm not sure if there's fights that we need to have. I think we mustn't take our eye off of the ball. I think that is the most important thing. Hard-won freedoms can be very, very easily taken away if we take our eye off the ball. If we saw what happened in Birmingham recently with the schools, with having a progressive, inclusive curriculum there, and it's that old line. First they came for X, then they came for so-and-so, and they came for so-and-so. We see the conversations around Black Lives Matter recently. If we have a Queer Lives Matter movement, is that going to happen? So I think it's less around what we should be fighting for. And being a real South Londoner, we need to be tooled up and ready for the next battles and fights, because they're always going to come. They're always coming for us, whether we're in the UK, we're in New York, Los Angeles, whether we're in Uganda or in Eastern Europe. We mustn't take our eye off the ball, and we have to remember that those health inequalities, that all those inequalities exist. So around HIV in the US, Black men are twice as likely to get HIV as white men. We should be looking at that. We're seeing attacks in Poland, in Eastern Europe. We should be addressing that. So I think those of us that are living in Northern Hemisphere countries in the West, which think, we're all sorted now, I can get my marriage, get my dog, and I can settle down and buy my plant. Actually, no. If you have your queer children, they're going to come for them.
Right. As the ACT UP slogan is, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. I remember sitting in a meeting a few years ago, and they thrashed up this stat, which was Black gay men are 15 times more likely to get HIV. And I said, they said, how do you feel? And I said, I'm really bloody angry. Well, why are you angry? And my answer was, why are you not?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I like your phrase, we need to keep a queer eye on things. I think that's very, very useful. And, I want to add to that one of the things that I see as the struggle of the moment is try to make sure that we can be gently critical of each other, but to not fight amongst ourselves. I think that it's an old problem. Certainly in feminism and women's liberation, it was a problem. The idea that the low-hanging fruit is each other, and that is a waste, and it's squandering our queer eyes, our queer critical eyes, and our fight. The fight that we do have in us.
I think that's incredibly interesting, because that's one of the things that I think of a lot when we talk about what are our goals moving forwards. The thing I see, because I am on the ground and I exist in a world where activism is online and it's in the comment section, it's in DMs, and we are currently, I feel, not united. There is so much infighting, and it is bringing up tropes that I thought we had progressed beyond within the queer community. And what's really interesting is, whilst we're busy doing all of that, government and legislators can ignore us. They're not going to take us seriously, because we're too busy having scraps with each other, bringing each other down. And, whilst that sounds very reactionary and people can go, well, I don't believe that's not happening. But, things that are there to protect us, like the Equalities Act, are simultaneously being used against us and helping people who perhaps are gender critical, and making waves in employment law. that will then be used as a case that comes back to time and time again. I don't want to allude to the case in question because it can upset a lot of people, but just Google the name Maya for starter, and you will see those shockwaves that are leading to some big systemic changes in not only our personal lives, but the way that employers and governance are thinking about their own responsibility to LGBTQIA plus people and other marginalized communities as well. We're not the only group of people that are marginalized in the UK, and that's going to send shockwaves to there as well. And so when we think about queer resistance, what we actually should be talking about is queer solidarity, and that looks like unity, and we don't have it at the minute.
Yes, that's such a great phrase. Yes, that's right.
Absolutely.
Queer solidarity. Absolutely.
Solidarity. Yeah. I think it's interesting that you say, Ben, though, that a lot of the activism and the conversation is happening online and in the comment section. And I think that, Monica and I have both an experience of activism of being in the physical world. And, I think, Monica, excuse me if I'm wrong, but I think neither of us are under any illusion that when we were doing our grassroots right in the thick of it, we were all singing Kumbaya and getting on together. There were lots of battles in Black queer resistance and arguments, and that's the way that we moved forward, because we knew that we had to battle. I knew that some of the needs and whatnot I had were very different to some of my Black queer brothers and sisters. But by being in that space, by talking it through, by arguing it, by not seeing each other, we were able to work it through. And there's that thing of when you're online, as we all know, we're all familiar, that those things can escalate, deflate. But when you're face to face with somebody, it's simple like, hey, I didn't quite understand what you said. Let's have a coffee in the chat, and we're not going to sort it out. Okay, fine. But let's get back into that physical space and create that.
And, one of the things that being online gives us is that we can gather together internationally, and that's so important. So I suppose we need to do both, but I so agree with you, Mark. And, one of the things, if I give talks or workshops on activism now, is I have to say that analog is the most powerful, right? The non-digital is the way to make actual change happen. You can figure it out online, you can discuss it online, but when you're going to make those, have those scraps, real scraps that make things happen, queer comes from, as I've said, comes from feminism, comes from activism, and that means it is not resolvable. It is always going to be unfinished, and is always going to feel unsettling, and it's always going to upset us, because the word upset means to sort of move you from the place where you feel comfortable. Literally, like to upset a vase of flowers, it means it's not going to be grounded. And being upset is not the thing to avoid. Being upset is the thing to welcome, because it means that you're not going to be stuck.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. If something's making you uncomfortable, lean into that and think why, and how does that allow me to cause change? And I think, we talk about, people always go, well, I get asked these questions all the time, and I actually hate them. And they go, so, what's your hope? What's your perfect world? There isn't one. And that's kind of the point, because if it was perfect, it wouldn't be queer, right? And that's, that's just something. And I think people are looking for this sort of sanitized utopia version of queerness. And it's just not going to exist. It just doesn't exist. And that's not what we should be working towards. And I think that's really interesting. I'm just having my mind blown by these incredible conversations. And we've got about 10 minutes before we go for a comfort break. And I've kind of got like a big conversation that leans into some of the work that you've done, Mark. And, how queer resistance and subversion and, activism, in a comfortable word, can change people's lives, and most specifically people's health, looking at the work you've done with HIV and AIDS. How do you think queer resistance has been a tool that you've been able to employ throughout your long career?
I think that what I've been able to do is I think I've used the word earlier on about being unapologetic, and taking no prisoners has always been my own personal attitude, and trying to invest that in other people so they can recognize that they can also do that in the world, and that then helps them to live these healthier lives if they choose to. And I know, as a positive man, very early on in the epidemic, that I wasn't meant to be here. So everything I did was an act of subversion, was an act of pushing myself forward in the world. And I think that that's what's really driven me and continues to drive my work, to do things which are different, to do things which aren't within the cultural or the social norms. Because we talked earlier on about the seat at the table, and a friend of mine, a New Yorker as well, who's a therapist, said, start asking for a seat at the table when the seat at the table wasn't built for you. Build your own. And that is, obviously we should take seats at those tables, but we actually have to create our own spaces as well, and our own tables and our own movements to exist. And I think that's what's really worked for me. If it isn't there, if I don't see it, then I have to build it for myself and for my community, and they will come along to it.
That's so incredibly powerful. And I think, what's really interesting is it's probably very similar to your own experiences, Monica, that, you have to go against what is expected of you. And, how do you think that you would have operated, not only as an academic, but as a person, if you didn't use queer resistance? Would any of it worked?
I can't imagine it. It's like saying, when I've been asked, it'd be like asking me, how could you imagine the world not being a feminist? It's sort of like it's built in. And I try to be brave enough to be unsettled and to, but at the same time, to take my privilege and to unsettle others as a teacher, as an academic, and as a person in the world, and not unsettle as in slash and burn, of course not, but to actually ask the hard questions and to, as we were saying earlier on, both Mark and I, equip people, make people feel empowered and have the agency to be able to handle those hard questions and ask many in turn for themselves and of themselves. So I guess that's what queer means to me, and how I see the world queerly and how I live in the world queerly is to be brave enough. The other word that hasn't come up today, but I really associate with queerness, is vulnerability. And the ways that we have the bravery to be vulnerable in order to make change. As an activist, I think that's what I'm trying to do, is to make change, or be willing to make change, or to hold on to the things that don't need to be changed. You're not just changed for its own sake, but to be willing to be vulnerable, and to willing to be challenging, and to be willing to be kind and compassionate. I think that, one of the things I say at the beginning of classes is that we're going to make accidents, because when you learn things, you make mistakes and you feel uncomfortable and you might trip over yourself. And I don't want people to feel like they can't speak for fear of saying the wrong thing. So we have to also be brave enough to hear people say things that might sound a little offensive or might sound a little off, and not jump, but just, sit with that and correct it or criticize it, but gently and compassionately, and not sort of feel like, oh, I've won something because I saw that, I caught something.
Yeah. That's so interesting. It's so powerful. There's a few things that really resonated with me. First of all, vulnerability. I think that's a huge part of queer resistance. And for me, 75% of my life has been miserable. There have been times when I haven't seen a future. I haven't seen any way forwards with it. And then it shook me for a bit. And then I was like, that's kind of the point. You've come so far and you are still here. Now it feels like my job to sort of bring that experience, to bring the messiness that was my existence, and say, this is my opportunity to tell you that you can also do the same things with not the best start, or not being able to see yourself in the world. And I think it's also really interesting that you talked about the us versus them, the who's correct, who's the winner of this. And it just isn't about that. Because if somebody wins, if somebody is deemed to be right, that's going against what queerness and acceptance should stand for. It's very much about, I can exist with difference and it be okay for me right now, but how can we help each other learn? I think we forget that, every conflict moment, especially within the community, is also a chance for us to learn and absorb something that we just didn't have, which is really, really interesting. I think we've got 6 minutes, and I think, we've talked about some things. We've also talked about some sort of grassroots things. I'd like to hear from both of you on, recommendations for our audience of how they can sort of experience authenticity with their own queerness, but also practical steps to use that as a tool for resistance. I don't know who wants to go first.
You go first, Monica.
Okay, well, I will continue on my theme, which is to, if we really want to take queer resistance, you know, and find ways of applying it to ourselves or applying ourselves to the world, is maybe approach things by thinking, how is this going to change how I think? Or how is this going to unsettle what I already believe? Instead of looking for things to confirm what we understand or confirm what we believe. Or when we meet a friend, not always look for the ways that we are the same, the ways that we think the same, but maybe to think about the ways. Now, this could be scary, you know, how do we disagree? How am I going to change my mind about something? And we're not always brave enough to do it. And I think we have to honor those times when we're not feeling brave and we want things to feel recognizable and secure. But when we can be brave, when we can open ourselves up to challenge and provocation and difference, we are really obligated to, right? Queerness is about letting in the uncomfortable and tolerating that, tolerating disappointment and the uncomfortable and the unfinished.
And I think I follow up with two things, which is one, which is connect, you know, and I think that we are connecting, right? But there is a thing about trying to get in the real world and make those physical connections with each other. They're healing and they're wonderful and they can be long lasting. But I think it's the other thing as well, which Monica said earlier on, which is let's stop the infighting with ourselves. You know, we haven't got this far to continue having battles. We've always had fighting between ourselves, but let's try to make those battles progressive and move us forward. We cancel too quickly and we don't learn from each other. You know, I'm trying to learn all the time as an older man. You know, and it'd be really easy for me to shut down conversations because you know what? I know stuff because I've been here. But, you know, actually, there's a hell of a lot for me to learn as well. So, yeah, be open to that learning and connect.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I also, you know, we've talked about infighting, we've talked about it's okay to make each other uncomfortable. And I think, you know, it's probably going to sound a bit confusing for me to go backwards a little bit, but it's also really interesting to accept that some people may not have those tools to be that activist right now. And, you know, we can't use people's intersections as you must stand up and you must go and do. I was doing some interviews for a large chunk of publication that's coming out next year under my own name. And it's the incredible Lexi Chandra over in New York. And I talked to her about, you know, how being trans is often, you know, seen as you're a social tool. And it was really struck me was that she said, I'm trans and I'm a teacher, I'm not a trans teacher. You can't expect me to constantly educate about my own transness. And what's really interesting is I have the right to say I don't want to. I think it's really interesting that when we talk about how we can move forwards and be authentic, it's also saying that we don't all have to do it all the time. And that's really interesting as well, because then it allows different people the space to talk. If we only hear from the loudest and strongest in our communities, well, are we beginning to go back into that echo chamber? Are we going backwards on ourselves? Are we in a cycle? So it's allowing people to have the room to do it when they're ready to do it. I think is really interesting.
Absolutely.
Oh, my goodness. We are running just a little bit early, but I think let's give us all ourselves a little bit of a break. We have got a comfort break coming up. I am running a little bit early, but I'm a vanguard. I'm going to do what I want. We're going to go to break. But if you do have any questions, do put them in the comment boxes and we will do what we can with the time. We're giving long answers here, so we probably will only get 2 or 3 done, but we'll do our best and it'll be worth it. So I'm going to thank everyone. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Russ. You're doing an excellent job. Let's go to our comfort break right now and we will be back. I'm just checking the time at 20 to 6, 17:40. Go to the loo, grab some water. Yeah, we'll be back soon. welcome back, everyone, to the second part of the second panel of the Human Rights Forum of Manchester Pride. It's Q&A time because I put my glasses on because these words are tiny. Let's jump straight in with these questions. Question number one, this is to all of us. Any recommendations for how we can be more authentically expressing ourselves in queerness? How can we do that? Who wants to jump in?
Go for it, Monica, because I'm not too sure on this one.
It's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say find your allies. Find your allies. And allies, remember, are not just the people who are going to look exactly like you or think exactly like you or be exactly like you. And in fact, I think the best way to find your allies is going to sound a little counterintuitive, but you can tell by now that that's my way of thinking about things, is to offer to work on someone else's struggle. Offer your efforts on someone else's project. And again, it could be within queer community. It could be what looks like without the queer community. There's no such thing really. Everything belongs to queer in some way. But find your allies and find them by maybe finding a place that isn't an obvious place for you, but that you have to adapt to other people's world.
I would say, I use an example of the thing that I tell people who are diagnosed with HIV and they're really worried and frightened and concerned and they feel incredibly isolated. And one of the first things I say to them is, you're not alone. There are millions of us in the world. And you may never meet them, but you are part of a massive family of people that are living with this virus, and there are millions more who have gone before you. And recognize that you are connected. So as well as finding your allies, there is a real sense of you're not alone in this world. And I think when you realize you're not alone in this world, that gives you a certain power, and we have a certain superpower. And what's the worst that can happen to us? Yes, obviously, if we are in certain spaces, certain places, there can be a threat of violence, there can be a threat of loss, and all of these things. But sometimes we have to weigh up what are we going to lose for what we're going to gain. And if I look at my own experience again and again, I have to state I have a lot of privilege as a man of a certain age, but that has given me a certain amount of freedom. And so just to be open about myself and to express that has given me a huge sense of power as well. So we're much more powerful than we actually realize. You are a lot more powerful than you realize.
Oh, that's so incredible. And I think, for me, I work with a lot of younger people, and, sometimes the question of authenticity is, where do I start? What actions do I do? And I think it's really interesting when we forget we have queer history and it exists. Go to a library, go and do some research. Look up people who existed 100 years ago that were proudly queer and subverting what gender is. When people come to me and say, I don't feel like I can be non-binary because there's nothing there for me. Google Claude Cahun, look at their incredible portraits and their art and their work. And that's in 1920, and they existed in that time. And if they had the power to do that, you can do small things for yourself today. And, the other piece of advice, on a personal level, always say yes to yourself. If you thought it, if you think it, if you want it, say yes. And I think Mark's got a really valid point. What's the worst that's going to happen? My therapist says that to me all the time when it comes to anxiety and decision making. Think about the worst outcome, mitigate for it, and work out what you'll gain from it as well, which is really interesting.
And so Ben, just on that, you made a really good point about Googling. Because people always say, no, Google is your friend, right? I had a fascinating day last week at the Bishopsgate Institute in London, where I spent an afternoon with Steph down there, Steph Dixon, and just went through some of our incredible archive. Yeah. And I was so motivated and enriched to see these stories of trans communities in the 1950s and 60s in the UK. I was like, what? And that immediately made me feel, actually, we're doing this.
Mark clearly has a very, very happy job there. So we'll just
But I think know your history is so crucial. I'm so glad you brought that up, Ben. It also seems counterintuitive to think looking back is a way of thinking about how you're going to enter into the world in the present. But my goodness, knowing your history is a kind of weird solidarity, but it really is solidarity, because your people have been there, even if you think you're the first of your kind.
Yeah.
You're not.
You're not.
Yeah, it's sort of like a queer security blanket that you can take with you, because these people have lived and died and breathed on this earth before you even have thought. It's really, really important. Let's jump on to another question. This is coming from someone who has said, when I think of resistance, so much of it is rooted in more unstructured formats and environments, e.g. public protest. And they've asked of all of us, how would you advise resistance in more institutionalized public sectors? I don't know who wants to jump on that first.
I mean, I think that obviously, you know, in structured, institutionalized public sectors, you know, if we're working in those spaces, if we're employed, then one needs to be cautious and careful, and, you know, thinking about their well-being as well as their livelihoods and their work, which is clear. But join unions, join, you know, movements within your institutions. You know, so if you're a young person and there's an LGBTQ plus movement there, get involved in it, you know, or start one up. You know, these are where we can chip away. Remember that you've already mentioned, Ben, you know, we have things like the Equalities Act in this country, which, whilst it might be being chipped away, but, you know, you've also mentioned about, you know, writing to your MPs. So these are the small direct actions that we can take where we may feel, well, actually, it's the education system, I'm never going to make a change. Well, actually, I think the work that Monica and I have both been doing over the years has demonstrated that by chipping away, you can make change. So again, going back to that original point we just made, you have more power than you realize. But find your allies, join groups, set those groups up, and if those don't work, get letter writing, send those emails, bug the hell out of people.
Yeah, and I would add to that exactly, Mark. I so agree with that. And to think, you know, what is either my privilege within the institution, or what is the privilege of the institution itself, and how can I or we share that? Because I think when we think of resistance or protest, we think of, again, being critical or making change or fighting, but it could also be about how a kind of self-reflection, and how can I share or extend, not just add a place at the table, but to make tables for, you know, more recognizable tables for people who might not actually even, you know, be able to access or notice the table that you're at. And the other thing, and I'm going to go back to what Ben said, is a history lesson. I mean, that's a kind of resistance, you know, a little kind of workshop or salon or reading group where you get to say, let's learn something. And that's resistance as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I as a consultant, I see that there's so much potential out there that, you know, there are people within organizations that, you know, are really leaning into their queerness, but also like they've got bills to pay and they want to keep their job. But you can do this kind of resistance by bringing someone from the outside in. When you have that space, there's a position for like an hour for your organization to learn from someone. Bring someone in, because someone like me, when I go into an organization, they're not employing me. Yes, they're paying me, but they'll have to fight my agent if they don't want to. And I'm going to come and I'm going to shock you, and I'm going to scare those employees. I was doing a talk with a brand that I'm not actually allowed to say because I got NDA'd about it. But I was basically really sort of complaining to the middle management about, you know, I'm only able to talk to you because that's who I'm allowed to speak to. But, you know, you're not going to go and make any of these changes because you don't really care. The only changes that happen is those people at that top management table. And then I was speaking to the MD of the European wing of this company, who was actually having their mind blown by thoughts. So bring queer people into your safe, secure spaces, because that won't reflect on you. They can do all they want to. So if you're in those corporate environments and you have some sort of position of power, bring other voices in, because they can come and go in their own safety and they can really shift things up. So that's, you know, it's an interesting corporate approach, because businesses have corporate responsibility now. And it wouldn't be queer if we didn't abuse that in some sort of way. So, you know, take their money, but also blow their minds, okay? We've got time for one last question. People can be so much more fixed and polarized in their views on social media. How do we support people to sit with complexity and the shades of grey on social media? And how do we engage in that conversation? I don't know who wants to jump with that.
Well, it's really hard. You know, social media is the place where things are made simple and things are made reduced to the most obvious, or to, you know, I like it or I don't like it, or I love it or I hate it. I guess one of the ways is to, you know, try to be, again, brave enough to make something more complicated than it looks like in the conversation that's happening in the moment, and say that's not all that's going on, or that's not the only way to think about it, or maybe we all need to learn a little more about this. And the other thing that hasn't come up today, which is I sort of blame myself for, but to think maybe about art and culture and how queer art, which is one of the best ways to challenge ourselves about how to apprehend the world, is to see it through the lens of something that maybe, I don't just mean a gay film or a lesbian novel. I mean queer art that actually sort of blows your mind and you can't quite grasp it. That is a way to complicate how you see how to keep your queer eye on things, which is a phrase from Mark that I'm now going to employ. And I don't know, maybe when something's happening on social media, that looking at art or looking at culture in a way that complicates things so that you don't have to put yourself on the line is a way to make it messier.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm going to steal that from Monica as well, you know, around engaging in art, queer art and culture, because, you know, that's one of my greatest loves. And we don't have those conversations enough. We're not informing the quick, snappy clapbacks beyond that, you know, and it becomes a bit of a competition. And I think that we have to allow people, because I think, you know, it's an interesting one that we as queer folk, you know, we're asking the world to understand us, to understand our differences and our complexities. We're screaming at the world for that. And therefore we need to kind of extend that kindness to others who we may come up against, right? And so one of the phrases that annoy me the most is, you know, Google is your friend. Google isn't your friend. Books are your friend. Films are your friend. Art and culture are your friend. So I think that these are the things that we should be doing when we want to engage, is when the battle starts, is to go, actually, why don't we look at this? You know, let me distract you with this wonderful Bette Davis quote over here, and then we'll come back to the argument later. Yeah. Right? Or actually, let's talk about how Bette Davis and Joan Crawford inform the work that we do, because it might just distract us for a minute, and then we can get back to the things that we are really, really important.
Yes. Yeah.
I think, like, to develop on that, because, you know, I exist in this world of social media, I sometimes try and shake people out of where they're currently existing. And I think you both said, look at things that have existed. And a really interesting book that I read recently it's called A Nazi Word for a Nazi Thing. And it explored how Nazi Germany literally destroyed the queer community and how far we would have been had that not happened. And it really, really surprised me looking at sort of communities like Quilt Bag and words like that, and, you know, all that past that exists and all that culture, community, healthcare advice that was just wiped out through blanket hatred and also fear. When you show someone that kind of perspective, they suddenly go, okay, so suddenly our little squabble don't really matter. Okay, it's good to have differences, it's good to be critical, but there's a bigger picture here. And we still need to have that unity to remember what can be taken away from us if we take our queer outfit, as Monica said. Really interesting. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts. We have a minute if you have anything else you wish to say.
Well, I'm going to say something again that I've said, and I'm going to say it in a slightly different way, which is, if you're feeling that someone's saying something offensive or saying something wrong, do the hard thing and take a moment and think about where they're coming from and why they're coming from there. I mean, they might be a jerk, and that is fine, but it will benefit you to have a moment to think through what's going on. That's not just about them being a bad person and you're being a good person. I think that will help. I think that's a queer attitude. I do.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And I think one of the reasons I know that I do this work and I've done my activism, because I love my community. I'm informed by love, first and foremost. The fighting, the screaming, the shouting, it's all informed by love. And I think if we continue to carry that forward and we work with that, we will continue to win these battles and we'll be tooled up for the ones that are yet to come.
Thank you so much, both of you, both Monica and Mark, for joining me
Thank you,
today.
Ben.
It has
Thank
been
you, Russ. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
a pleasure. We have come to the end of the Human Rights Forum. We've just got some thank yous and some final pointers. So first of all, I would like to thank Monica and Mark from this session, and of course Russ, but also from the panel that went before us, the incredible Rita, Debbie, Jason, Kay, and Sen. Some final housekeeping that you may or may not be aware of. There will be a reading list that will be sent to everyone who has attended this panel. And I think if anything that we can reflect on from the panel you've just watched, please maybe pick one thing off that list and actually go and read it. It might feel like a big thing to do, but it will really, really help you as you move forwards. You're also going to get a feedback form for this event. Please try and complete that form. I know these kind of things are annoying, especially when there's no reward at the end of it. However, your reward is helping make this event a better event next year, a more accessible event, a more inclusive event. So really think about the things you've listened to, the pledge that you've also signed, and also go, maybe it is my job to fill in this feedback form to give to the people that come to this event next year. Again, I'd like to thank all the panelists that have joined us. Thank you to Russ for doing incredible interpretation. Also, the gorgeous angels doing the live captioning. I'd also like to personally thank Megan and Christopher, the people behind the screen that you aren't seeing, and the entire team at Manchester Pride for doing an incredible job in not only a tough moment in the world, but also a tough Pride season for the corporation that is Manchester Pride. Well done for persevering and doing an incredible job. The final thing, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming today, to being vulnerable, sharing your questions. You've made us think harder, and it's been really enjoyable. And to round out Manchester Pride, if you have the time, I would really love to remind you to attend Manchester Pride's candlelit vigil from 9 o'clock tonight. That runs until 10 o'clock. It's in Sackville Gardens in Manchester. If you're there, if you're not, you can access that from a live stream on YouTube. The vigil allows us to remember those that we've lost to HIV and AIDS. And as LGBTQ plus people, we can join together to continue to fight for this really large part of our culture and the stigma that still exists, and that, you know, someone who, an icon like Mark, is doing so much great work in. The vigil also provides a space to remember from those that are suffering and persecuted, and presenting an opportunity to stand together in a united front as we recognize the many challenges that are still faced by LGBTQ plus communities, both in the UK and around the world. It's a really important time to thank ourselves for the celebrations we've had, but also stop and remember, explore our history, but also contemplate our future and think what we want to do moving forwards. And as I said, the vigil will also be streamed on the Manchester Pride YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining us on this Human Rights Forum. Thank you to everyone that has participated, done the hard work, and also you, the audience. All that's left for me to do is to wish you a happy Pride. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.